Hi guys, and welcome to the opening session of the course Monetary Policy in a New Era, which I'm holding at the University of Neuchâtel in spring 2021. My name is Fabio Canetg, and I hold a PhD from the University of Bern in monetary economics, and I'm also a journalist at Swiss Info and the Republik. So this is the opening session of this seminar, Monetary Policy in the New Era, and this YouTube video, of course, is not very interactive. It cannot be. The idea is to give you an idea of what the course is about, what I'm going to discuss with my students. But first of all, I need to answer the question, who cares, right? Why would anyone care about having a course, Monetary Policy in the New Era? And I asked that myself, and to find out, I asked the students at the University of Bern, where I worked last year, or actually it was 2 years ago when I conducted this survey. And I asked the students if they understand the new monetary policy measures that have been implemented since the great financial crisis and that are proposed to be implemented in the future. Stuff like average inflation targeting that is adopted by the Fed, and also topics like helicopter money. Do students actually understand what these policy proposals are about? And the survey question was pretty simple. How well could you explain to a friend how a new policy measure, here you can just have like forward guidance, quantitative easing, negative interest rates, average inflation targeting. How well could you explain that to a friend? How is it implemented in practice? And I had a scale from 1 to 8, where 1 was very poorly and 8 was very well. And the survey results were quite astonishing, I think, to me at least, because a lot of people reported a 1 to 3 in answering this question. So basically they were saying, I cannot explain forward guidance to a friend at all. And we will see the numbers just now. You have two different bars here. I think I have to move this a little bit. The upper bar has an N of 150 students and the lower bar has an N of 60 students. The difference is these are all the students that I asked. These were all bachelor students in a fifth semester course, if I remember correctly. And these are all the bachelor students who have taken at least 2 out of 3 macro courses at the University of Bern. And as you can see, the results hardly differ, right? This line is basically at the same point as this line here. So I work with the smaller sample group in which the students have actually taken 2 out of 3 macro courses. And the results are in orange here, the share of students who reported a 1 to 3. So basically the students who said, I cannot explain, in this case here, negative interest rates to friends at all. So I don't know anything about negative interest rates. And here we have 45% of the bachelor students at the University of Bern who have taken at least 2 macro courses out of 3. And 45% of them say, I cannot explain negative interest rates to a friend. So that is a pretty high number, I think. And actually the numbers are high for a couple of different new monetary policy measures, including quantitative easing, where about 40% of the students cannot explain it to a friend. Forward guidance, even worse, a lot worse actually. 75% of the students who say, I don't know nothing. I literally don't know nothing about forward guidance. I cannot explain it to a friend. And these are bachelor students, right? So they have taken two macro courses. And exchange rate floor is a little less, so it's 50%. Even though Switzerland had an exchange rate floor against the euro, 50% of the bachelor students say, I couldn't explain the workings, the implementation and the transmission of an exchange rate floor to a friend. And the second thing is, I asked them, do you want to learn more about this? And most of the people said, yes, definitely. 98% said, I want to learn what forward guidance is, how it works, how it's implemented. 96% said they wanted to learn more about quantitative easing. So you see, these numbers are all in the same ballpark. Students are actually, apparently, according to the survey, interested in learning more about monetary policy, especially about new monetary policy instruments like the ones that are listed here. Of course, let me just say here that these results do not suggest in any way that teaching is of limited quality at the University of Bern. It's very good quality. I did my bachelor's there, I did my master's there, I liked it a lot. The thing is, in my view, that macro courses have to cover a lot of different topics, right? You have fiscal policy, you have monetary policy, you have labor policy, whatever. And there's just not enough time to go very deep into monetary policy. But monetary policy has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And it's not so simple to include it all into just a basic macro course. And that's why I think that my course is important, because it adds to the basic courses, right? Where they learn basically like you move up interest rates, and then you make sure that inflation is not going through the roof, or you lower interest rates to stimulate the economy. These are the basics of monetary policy. But as we have just seen, they know little about the new instruments, and maybe they should learn about them, and they want to learn about it, and they can do it in my course. And actually, I also asked them, would you come to such a course if I offered it at the University of Bern, which I do not. I offer it at the University of Neuchâtel at the moment. And 44% said, yes, very much. I would very much like to take a seminar, Monetary Policy in a New Era. So if you're convinced already that this is a very good course, and if you're by any chance a dean of a faculty at another university in Bern, or just a faculty member, and you think, oh wow, that's great, this guy designed the course during his PhD studies where he actually worked on monetary policy, which I did like for 4 or 5 years, and I'm still working on monetary policy. And if you think I would like to have that course at my university as well, please get in touch with me. That would be great. So I'm looking for new opportunities to teach that course. It's already there. It's ready to be taught, and of course to be updated every now and then, but it's ready. Get in touch with me. Here's a question to start with. We cannot really do it here because this is a YouTube video. I want to start off the opening session with something interesting for the students. The first part will of course not be in the opening session at the university, because they just don't need to know these numbers. They have already signed up, right? But here's just a question about which of these 4 is the most epic quote. Maybe I should move that once again here. The most epic quote in monetary policy. Well, Lagarde says the ECB is not here to close spread in March 2020. Bernanke, who said subprime mortgages are no problem at all. That was in 2007, before the great financial crisis, which was caused by subprime mortgages. Then Hildebrand, who introduced the minimum exchange rate against the euro. And of course, Draghi, who said the ECB will do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. So you can just like think about these quotes for yourself. I personally like number 4 a lot. Mario Draghi basically ended, as you well know, the Eurozone debt crisis with that one sentence. So here's the outline of the opening session of the course, and I will not do everything that I will do with the students in the opening session. But what I would like you to have after watching this video is an idea of what the course is about and how it is structured. So in the beginning, I would like to give the students and you actually an introduction. So what are the course objectives and how is the work in progress organized? Then in block 2, I would like to give, once again, you and the students in class later, 2 instruments to think about these new monetary policy measures. So basically, these are the 2 instruments that we're going to use during the semester, during the seminar, to think about these new monetary policy measures or proposals. The Poole model, which is a model of the interbank market, which is very similar to the LM model in an ISLM model. And balance sheets. Balance sheets, I think, are very important to understand new monetary policy measures. And then I will go through some topics that the students can select in these 3 areas or 3 blocks, and just give you a flavor of one of each of them in this video here. So course objectives. It's very important to me to say that monetary policy in the new era is a very interactive course. So it's not supposed to be a lecture, it's a seminar first off. And secondly, it's supposed to be interactive in the sense that I'm gonna be talking mainly in the opening session to give the students an overview of what they can work on. But later on, I won't be talking that much. I want students to work with each other, to come up with questions, to try to answer the questions of a different group, to apply the tools that I give them in the first session. And my knowledge, of course, I'm around as well, to figure out how, let's say, quantitative easing works or forward guidance works. So students are supposed to interact with each other. They're supposed to give presentations. They're supposed to prepare discussions of presentations. They're supposed to come up with a final presentation, so write an essay, to read stuff. That is the idea of the seminar. And it's about implementation and transmission. So the 2 parts of monetary policy: how is it implemented and how does it transmit to the real economy? And the students should mainly learn the intuition behind implementation and transmission, because it's not so easy to put that into a model that is easy to teach, right? The students are usually very good at models, but they're not so good, in my experience at least, at intuition. And I want to give the intuition behind current monetary policy operations to the students such that they can read the newspapers and have like a good discussion about monetary policy. To be a bit more precise, here are the 4 course objectives, and I spent a lot of time to come up with these course objectives. So the first one would be the students should be able to explain the implementation and transmission of monetary policy. So not just the implementation, not just the transmission, but both. Second, they should be able to understand the theoretical foundations of the new policy measures. For example, let's take average inflation targeting. What's the theoretical foundation for it? Why is it important to influence inflation expectation? Where does that come from? Like that would be maybe the rational expectation revolution, right? That basically started it. That's the root of average inflation target. They should be able to make that link. Here again, we have, describe the link between new monetary policy measures and more traditional ideas. So if you think about that, the traditional idea would be to lower interest rates when the economy is not going well. And now with, say, forward guidance, the idea is to promise to keep interest rates low for a long time. So that's different, right? But it's obviously related. What's the link exactly between the traditional approach and the new approach? And then the 4th objective is that students should be able to evaluate the pros and cons of different policy measures. This is mainly about the alternative policy proposals that are around. Let's take, say, once again, average inflation targeting versus the current system, symmetric inflation targeting that the ECB is currently using, or it's likely to going to adopt the average inflation targeting approach, but that's a very good exercise, right? Evaluate the pros of moving from symmetric to average inflation targeting, or the cons of that, or take more extreme proposals like helicopter money. What's a pro, what's a con? Then I expect the students basically to work during the semester, participate actively in the discussions, read the suggested articles. I want to make the reading load light such that they do it. And they know if they sign up for the course, they know what the course is about. They know the structure of the course. They know that they're supposed to interact. But people have told me that they actually like that, right? What they don't like is preparing a presentation, give the presentation, and then everyone's like silent. What I will do, and I will show you in a minute, is assign discussion groups to each other, and then they try to figure out together how quantitative easing works, for example. They have 2 presentations, 1 discussion, and in the end, they write an essay, a very short essay. So the work in progress, let me just show you the syllabus, because that was quite a lot of work. I guess you should still see this here. So this is 16 pages that I came up with during my PhD. So it's the motivation for the course, the content of the course. Here you can see the 3 blocks that I'm going to discuss later. So the students can work on unconventional monetary policy measures. They can work on monetary policy tightening strategies like interest on reserves. They can work on alternative monetary policy frameworks like helicopter money. And I always worked out the benefits for the students. I tried to figure out what's actually cool for the students if they learn about alternative monetary policy frameworks. Then we have the topics that I will talk about later, course objectives that I have talked about, and then the work in progress. So we have this opening session, which you're basically in now. I talk a little bit, I give the students a sense of what they can work on, such that they can actually understand or decide what they would like to work on, which area they find most interesting. Then we have, importantly here, we have an intermediary session 1, which is highly interactive. So basically the idea is that students by that time have chosen their topic, quantitative easing, for example, and another group has chosen forward guidance. And I'm sure they're going to have questions about it, right? They read a little bit because they get some starting points, and then they will have questions about it. And they're supposed to ask another group, can you answer my question? Can you explain me what I don't understand? Maybe I can explain what you don't understand. Then we have an expert coming from the Swiss National Bank who is giving a talk, which is going to be super exciting. Then we have preliminary presentations where the students present what they have understood of their topic so far. Let's say once again, quantitative easing, that's where we stand, and it's not graded, but still, they should just say, here we are, and these are the open questions. And they're having another group discussing their work. So they get some help from other students once again. And of course, from me, I will be there. Then we have bilateral meetings in the run-up to the final presentation. So students can just talk to me about open questions. And the final presentation is basically just like, okay, that's what I found out during the semester. And then they write an essay. This is the timing, not so interesting for you, grading neither. But here, this is the cool part, I think, of the syllabus. It's from page 9 to 16, it's literature, right? So if anyone says, I would like to work on negative interest rates, then they can go to this part of the syllabus and say, okay, these are my starting points. I should maybe read that, and I give them basically the punchline of these papers or articles, and the same for other things like central bank debt securities here, alternative monetary policy frameworks. A lot of starting points for the students, a lot of things they can read if they want to, and then a lot of interaction during the work in progress. Here are the two models or two instruments that I would like the students to understand a little bit, and I would like to give them an intuition in the opening session 1, such that they can use these two instruments to understand quantitative easing, forward guidance, whatever they want to work on. And the two instruments are first the Poole model, or let me just call it the LM model. That would just be a reference for those of you who are familiar with the literature, the LM model. But before we go into the LM model, we maybe have to take a step back and ask ourselves, so what's so different about monetary policy now, right? Before the great financial crisis, I think it was pretty straightforward. Central banks increased the interest rate when the inflation was high, and they lowered the interest rate when they wanted to stimulate the economy. And the transmission basically was through the price of investment. If it was cheap to invest, a lot of people invested in whatever, in a new kitchen in a restaurant. And by that, you just stimulated the economy because someone had to pay someone to come, right? And to rebuild the kitchen, that very simply. And the rule, kind of a rule that the central banks followed was a Taylor rule, where they basically compared the expected inflation rate with the inflation target and said, okay, if this guy here is 2.5% and the inflation target is 2%, then because this guy here is positive and actually greater than 1, we're going to increase the interest rate. So what I just said before, if we're in a boom, central banks raise the interest rate. If we're in a recession, central banks lower the interest rate. That basically described monetary policy before 2007. And to implement the interest rate target, and here comes the LM model into play, or the Poole model, central banks adjusted the money supply. So that's the LM model or the Poole model, where on the x-axis you have the monetary base, on the y-axis you have the interest rate. The monetary base is the amount of money that commercial banks hold at the central bank, and they can exchange that money only with other commercial banks. So they can go to an interbank market and borrow or lend so-called M0, this central bank money, on that interbank market. And the price of lending and borrowing on this market was the interbank interest rate here. Of course, you have a supply that's determined by the central bank, how much money is in supply, and you have a demand for base money, for monetary base. And at the intersection, as in every demand and supply model, you have the equilibrium price, which is 0.75% in this case. Of course, let me just say here, we're in a YouTube video. I want to give you an overview of the course. During the semester, I will go a lot deeper here because students really need to understand what I'm talking about here. But just for the sake of time, your time, let me move a little quicker than I will during the semester, and tell you how central banks adjusted the interbank interest rate before the great financial crisis. If they wanted to lower the interbank interest rate, they basically just increased the money supply from here to here. And they used, in Switzerland, they used repo operations, repurchase operations to do that. They offered more liquidity. Actually, they offered liquidity at a lower price, a fixed rate tender price, and by that they decreased the interbank interest rates. That's the main takeaway here is it's demand and supply. If supply of money is higher than the price of money is lower, interest rates fall. That was before the great financial crisis. We will see later how that changed. Then there's a second instrument that I want students to use when they talk about, say, quantitative easing, and that's a balance sheet perspective. In my view, it's very important that people understand the balance sheet of commercial banks and central banks when they talk about new, or let's say unconventional monetary policy measures or new proposals. This is not the right scale. Just keep that in mind. We have the balance sheet of the central bank on the left, and on the right, we have the aggregated commercial bank balance sheet. Once again, here, I will go a little quicker than I will during the semester, but just to give you a flavor with what I want to work with. On the left of the aggregated commercial bank's balance sheet, you have the assets of the commercial banks, and on the right, you have the liabilities. On the asset side, you have, well, maybe let me start with the liability side. On the liability side, you have the deposits of firms and households. This is my bank account at, let's say, the UBS. Why is it a liability of the commercial bank? It's a liability of the commercial bank because I can decide at any point in time that I want to have the cash, right? I can just go to the ATM and take out the cash, and then my balance on my bank account goes down. That's why this is a liability of the commercial bank. They always have to be ready to give me the cash. Then they have some other liabilities, including capital, not so important for this course. And they have a lot of assets. They have some, let me start here, other assets that could be government bonds, that could be real estate, whatever. Then they have bank lending to the real economy. This is important to understand. This is an asset of banks, right? If they make a loan to the real economy, it's an asset. Just to give you an example, if they give me a loan of 10,000 Swiss francs, then I have to pay it back, let's say in 10 years. So the commercial bank has a claim against me. That's why it is an asset. And then they have sight deposits. Sight deposits have different names. Sight deposits, reserves, or commercial banks hold at the central bank. What's a sight deposit? The sight deposit is the same. It's a bank account. Every bank has a bank account. They have it at the central bank, right? I have my bank account at UBS here, and the UBS itself has the bank account, which is called sight deposits, at the central bank. And for that reason, the sight deposits here are a liability of the central bank, right? Like my bank account is a liability of the UBS, the bank account of the UBS at the central bank is a liability of the central bank against the UBS. But this guy appears here, and you can see that will be the same size later. Then cash is also a liability of the central bank. I don't want to go into that too much, but for those of you who know a little bit about it, just like in the 60s or so, you could exchange cash for gold, and that's basically the reason why cash is a liability of the central bank, because they always had to be ready to exchange the cash for gold, and the gold is on the asset side of the balance sheet of the central bank. So they have some gold in the basement, basically, and other assets, government bonds, also real estate, foreign currencies, euros for the Swiss National Bank, for example. And if we go into the right scale, you can see that this gets a lot smaller, and importantly, that this guy here, the liability is equally large than this assets here, because that's essentially the same, right? Just from a commercial bank's perspective, the bank accounts that commercial banks hold at the central banks are assets, and from a central bank's perspective, these are liabilities. Then I want to explain to the students, I do not want to do it here in this video because it just takes too much time, that commercial banks cannot lend M0, they cannot lend base money into the real economy. So the real economy, I do not have access to base money to M0. The restaurant down the road does not have access to M0. If commercial banks lend money to the real economy, they're creating new money. They're creating M1, which is not the same as just lending M0. Just graphically, you can see that like that. So if you're very quick in your mind, then you can see that banks create money whenever they make a loan to the real economy. They say, okay, Fabio has a 10,000 loan now. He has to pay it back in 10 years. That's why we have an asset as from a commercial bank's perspective. But we also have more liabilities because the balance on the bank account of Fabio went up from 50,000, let's say, to 60,000 when we granted him the loan of 10,000. So give me a second. Topics. Here I want to give you an idea of how I structure the opening session and also how I structure the discussions, because I want to structure it a little bit. I do not want to leave the students on their own. Basically, I would like to give them some questions that are interesting, that are maybe helpful to start with, to think about the different topics that the students can work on. And as I told you before, I have 3 areas, which is unconventional monetary policies, then exit strategies, and third is alternative monetary policies proposals. And I want to have a look at the first area first. So here they can work on quantitative easing, for example. It's called an unconventional monetary policy, but as you all know, we have been seeing QE for more than 10 years now, so it's kind of conventional already. But still, so remember the beginning of this presentation, the students said that they hardly know anything about quantitative easing. 50% of the students in a bachelor's class who have taken 2 macro courses said that they do not know anything about quantitative easing, so they can specialize in that in my course, or negative interest rates, or forward guidance, or dual interest rate policies, which I find super exciting, but it's kind of difficult, but it's cool, and exchange rate pegs. And what I would like to do in this video now is just focus on quantitative easing and give you a flavor how I will work through these 5 areas here with the students in the opening session. So I always try to just come up with the quickest definition of one of these instruments that I can think of. Quantitative easing is characterized by central banks buying up large amounts of assets, usually with the aim of reducing long-term interest rates. So it's central banks buying assets to reduce long-term interest rates. That's quantitative easing. It's always good to basically know what we're talking about, right? And then in a second step, I will always show the students some real-world example, quantitative easing in reality. That's a graph from 2000 to 2020. Let me take Japan. So they're doing quantitative easing. You can see that's the balance sheet of the central bank in percent of GDP. So it was around 25% until 2007 or so. And then it exploded here. So the balance sheet of the central bank of the Bank of Japan is huge at the moment. It's about 120%. In Switzerland, it's even larger. It's up here at 130, I think, at the moment. So the balance sheets of the central banks exploded because they bought a lot of assets. And they bought it with newly printed money, electronically printed money. So the money supply increased as well. Then I will always, to every single topic, I will give them also not just a reality perspective, but also a theory perspective. And here it is, in my view, helpful to work with both the instruments that I discussed before, the LM model first, where I open an entirely new region, right? In the beginning, I talked about this gray part. You just move around the money supply, and with that, you change the interest rate. But now we're having a massive expansion of the monetary base because central banks are printing so much money to buy up so much assets. That's what QE is. And money supply goes up to here, 35. That's just an artificial number. And the question, of course, is, does it really matter if we're at 30 or 35, right? This model would suggest that the interest rate would just be 0 at 30 and 35. So this is a question that we can address, and here maybe comes Bernanke into play. I think it was Bernanke who said quantitative easing works in practice, but not in theory, right? And that's what he had in mind here. It doesn't work in this theory, at least. And then we can also work with the other instruments that I want to give the students, or with which I want the students to work, namely the balance sheet perspective. I want them to understand what's actually happening in the balance sheet size. And I said it in the beginning, central banks are buying a lot of assets. And how do they buy it? They buy it with by creating money, right? By just printing electronically M0. And they're buying the assets from this part here from the bank. So these assets are moving to the central bank, and central banks are paying it with money. And that looks like that, right? The assets go up, this part here. This is the newly bought assets through QE, and it's paid with sight deposits. Of course, also here, I will go deeper in class, but that's just to give you an idea. I take a topic, define it, look into reality, and look at the two different models that I would like to work with during this semester. And then lastly, I have prepared a couple of questions for each of the topics that I would like the students to work on. If I have time, I will just basically let them talk to each other, guided by these questions. There are simple questions like, what are the balance sheet effects of QE on banks? That's what I just showed you. And then there are a lot harder questions. Does QE mainly work because of the flow or the stock effect, right? Doesn't matter if the Fed buys 80 billions every month, or doesn't matter that it has bought already 7 trillions. Then I do the same with all of the topics that I showed you. Negative interest rates, it's always the same pattern. Definition, reality, model, questions. Forward guidance the same. Let me just skip through them. If you're interested, actually, you can download these slides on my homepage, which is fabiocanetg.ch. Oh, now I went too far. So here's the second area where students can specialize in, which is monetary policy tightening. That's not the same like unconventional monetary policies, but it's basically the opposite. How do we get out of that, right? How do we raise interest rates when inflation picks up, right? We have to get out of this situation, and it's not so straightforward because the money supply is huge at the moment, right? So basically, before you just you decrease the money supply, and that pushed up interest rates, and now you cannot really do that because you're in the liquidity trap. There's so much money around, you just cannot lower that very quickly. So you have to do it differently. For example, with interest on reserves, and I would like to have a look at that. Here again, it's always structured the same: definitions, reality, model, or questions. Interest on reserves are the inverse of negative interest rates, which is basically the central bank paying a positive interest rate on the bank account, on the bank accounts of commercial banks. Commercial banks have their bank accounts at the central bank, and before the great financial crisis, they got like an interest rate of 0 always. And now, or maybe in the future again, central banks will pay a positive interest rate on these bank accounts. The Fed did that between 2015 and 20, and now they're paying 0 again, I think, or just very little. How does that look in the model? So if you remember the model in the beginning, we were in this gray area, right? And this is moved around the money supply to increase interest rates. It's not possible if the money supply is huge. We've already seen that. But what you can do is you just don't move the money supply, you move the money demand. How do you do it? Basically, just make it more attractive for banks to hold their money on their bank accounts at the central bank. How? By paying interest rates, right? If you make it more attractive for the commercial banks to keep their money on their bank accounts, they find it less beneficial to lend it to another bank. And that's why interest rates go up on the interbank market. Remember, that's the interbank market. Once again, you can go into much more detail here, and I will do it with the students. But this is just, once again, to give you a flavor of what we work with. I will try to make students understand that implementing monetary policy currently is about moving the money demand curve around, not the money supply anymore. Then again, you have the questions here. A hard one will be, why does only the marginal interest rate but not the average interest rate matter on the reserves, right? And that's related to having a tiered remuneration system like the Swiss National Bank, where commercial banks do not pay negative or positive interest rates on the entire amount of money they have at the central bank. So that's kind of complicated, but people have, the students have the starting points, they have videos, they have a lot of reading they can do, and then they should have the starting point, and I will help them here with these questions to understand what's actually going on when interest on reserves are paid. Oh, and here is a typo that I should correct it. This is another option to tighten monetary policy. I will not discuss it in this video, but in class. And then we have alternative monetary policy frameworks where students can, once again, say, I would like to work in that area, and then go deeper and say, work on helicopter money, right? What's the pros, what's the cons of helicopter money? How does it work? Why does it work? How is it implemented? And here I think, I actually think average inflation targeting is the most exciting topic here to work on, because the Fed adopted it in August 2020, and the ECB is likely to follow. Maybe I just have a look at what I wrote down for this guy. So average inflation targeting, what is average inflation targeting? Just in a couple of words. Let me start with symmetric inflation targeting. That's what the ECB is doing at the moment. They're always aiming for 1.9%, let's say 2% inflation, right? They don't care what happened in the past. If they look back and say, we've missed our inflation target for 10 years, we were always too low, we don't care. We just aim at 2% and stop there. We don't let inflation go above 2%. Average inflation targeting is different. Average inflation targeting has some history dependence, we call it. They look back and say, we have been too low for 5 years. That's why we want to be too high for the next 5 years in order to have the average of the inflation at 2%, right? And that's when J. Powell announced that in August 2020. It really looks like the future, which I like a lot. And here is some mathematical representation of what I just said. So basically, the central bank on the symmetric inflation targeting tries to minimize the difference between actual inflation and the inflation target, right? If it is too high or too low, the central bank wouldn't like that. Here's a square that makes it the central bank doesn't like too high or too low inflation rates. And whenever this guy is 2.5% and the inflation target is 2, the central bank tries to push down inflation and vice versa. It's different with average inflation targeting. You don't have the current inflation rate here, but the average inflation rate over the last J period, so let's say the last 5 years. If the average inflation over the last 5 years is below the inflation target, you try as a central bank under average inflation targeting to push inflation up, even if inflation currently is above 2%. That's the difference between symmetric inflation targeting and average inflation targeting. Here, once again, I have a couple of questions prepared for the students to work on with me, with texts, with videos that are prepared as well, of course, and with the other students. Here are the other policy proposals that students can work on: nominal GDP targeting and helicopter money, for example. And that's basically it. Let me conclude. Here are the topics that the students can work on in this course: monetary policy in a new area. They can choose from different eras. Well, it's not so easy. Unconventional monetary policy measures, monetary policy tightening strategies, and alternative monetary policy frameworks. And I've discussed a couple of them. And the students seem very interested in learning more about that. That's what the survey showed, right? I conducted this survey at the Uni Bern. 98% of the students who have taken already 2 macro classes said they want to learn more about forward guidance. In this course, they have the chance to do so. And this is really going to be great. I'm very much looking forward to having this course at the Uni Neuchâtel. Once again, if you're interested in having this course at your institution as well, please get in touch with me. I would be very happy to teach it at other institutions as well. That would be great. And with that, I thank you for your time and have a good day.